Welcome everyone to our study of progressive stages of meditation on emptiness by Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso. And the sound is good, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I thought I would stop asking the stupid question if you could hear me or not, but I'm glad. Thank you. So we're going to proceed with our study, and as always, when we undertake these kind of studies, we should put this into context, which is actually intended to, and that's where we should reflect what really drives suffering universally. And that is essentially this delusion around a self. The rigidity around self creates toxic minds. And what we are doing here is addressing this particular issue. But the mind is not something that we can just all of a sudden take a pill and all of a sudden we can just change our mind, or there's some sort of gimmick. It requires that we begin to see through a fundamental delusion that's taking place. And that is what the entire Buddha Dharma is about. And there's never a time where the Buddha assumes that we can just sort of like snap into it. There is an entire path. But that path requires that we're actually proactive in eliminating this delusion. And the first step in what eliminates delusion, which is wisdom, which is awareness. While we for a long time have been habituated towards what we can call ignorance, simply just looking away, unconsciousness, mindlessness, what we are introducing, essentially what the Buddha is introducing as the remedy, is not a new kind of way that we could numb ourselves or dope ourselves or sort of retreat into some sort of comfort zone, but rather to wake up and to discover that actually our nature is good, the nature of reality is good. So we don't need to ward off reality. We don't need to do something with ourselves. Our fundamental nature is good. But as long as we're caught up in this delusional condition, we need to introduce this quality of wisdom, which is seeing, which is beginning to look and see properly. Not see properly with Buddhist optics or introduce something Buddhist particularly. It's about using the Buddhist methods, but benefit ourselves. So the path is really just enabling us to free a natural condition that is already there. The natural condition doesn't need to be constructed. So that's where we approach this in terms of three ways of cultivating wisdom, which we've looked at before, which is first hearing the teaching, arriving at a personal understanding of that, not just saying, oh, well, the man said so, it must be true, it's from the Buddha, amen, but seeing what the Buddha wants us to do is actually take a look. And that's where we then need to apply this. We need to hear this. We need to take it serious. We need to actually apply this. Read the book. Ponder the words. Otherwise, it's just going to be entertainment. Oh yeah, Monday afternoon, there's this guy who's talking about Buddhism. It's awfully nice. He's a reasonably sort of cool guy. And, you know, he had some wonderful teachers. And there's a good ambiance, you know, sort of, you know, there's a nice sort of feel-good event happening. But no, this is actually intended, and that's the kindness of the Buddha, is really the Buddha says the boogeyman in your corner doesn't exist. The suffering that you're experiencing doesn't necessarily have to be there. And that's where please take the medicine. And that's where we then actually look at it, study it, make it our own, make these insights our own. And that's where we need to hear, we need to reflect, and then we need to put this into a dimension of actual experience. And that's what we do with the practice of meditation. But meditation needs to be informed by this vision, to actually understand that, hey, what I'm seeing as a snake, if I actually look, there is actually just the rope. There is the perception of a boogeyman in the corner. Actually, there's not. Somebody keeps telling me there's not. I should probably look. Oh yeah, it's true. But we need to familiarize ourselves, because for such a long time, our mind has been conditioned to follow thought after thought after thought after thought after thought. And that's why we need to actually short circuit this project and sort of break out of that chain. See, oh, you know, all these delusional projections that we've been subscribing to, thought after thought after thought. they're actually not substantial. They only exist in the thought. So to break that, we need to initially have somebody who says, hey, life is actually good outside of our heads. Life is actually good outside of our thinking. Look up, look at space, look at the trees, smell the flowers, break out. So that's what we're doing with the practice of meditation on emptiness, or vipassana, or whatever we choose to see it, to call it. So I think this must be in Canada or something like that. So, pardon. Okay. So we've come thus far, the fruit of the Shravaka practice. So, having on the basis of what we've said before, and remember, this is something that builds on what the last week was about. I actually don't do this thing that probably a good teacher should be, is take students up and have them actually say, okay, what were we talking about last week? Because other than that, then it's just going to be entertainment. Oh yeah, more words, nice words, they're sort of cool, and so on. And then, forget it. There's a logic, there's a sequential logic here. We're building an argument, we're building an insight, we're doing something proactively here. You do a course in, I don't know, carpentry, you need to actually first sort of establish the basis understanding of the fundamentals. Then you add to that, then you add to that, then you add to that. Then you need the experience, then you need the apprenticeship. Go out in the field and try it out. That's where we begin to own the material. Whether we're learning carpentry, learning to drive a car, learning to make a particular dish, there needs to first know what comes first, then comes next, then comes after that, etc. There's a sequence where we build up, and that's where then we end up with an actual real dish. And that's where there's a learning process taking place here, where we're actually learning something. We're not just hearing something and then it goes in one ear and out the other. We're learning something. We should emerge from this study with actually some sense of, yes, I've studied that and I've understood what it was that I was talking about. And this is very helpful. There has to be that. I'm sorry to say that, but that's a fact. That's okay. So here we are then. We're going to be looking at different ways in which we can approach this understanding of vipassana, or this understanding of emptiness. And we've already then built an understanding on the basis of analyzing. Can we actually find the conditions for a self? This is what we're going to be looking at continually. But what we are essentially discovering is that this construction of a self is in fact just something that we impute. Just like we impute snake on a rope, we impute self on what is in fact so many different things. And that's where, like the Khenpo sings, we're actually pretty confused, because we say, I am sick, but then we say, I have a headache. So what is it? Is it us who is sick, or is it that there's something beside us that is not well? So that needs to right away sort of go, shock us, sort of go, yeah, that's right. But he makes an important observation, which is, and that's so common, and maybe particularly for us who are approaching Buddhism in the modern world, where spirituality very often is understood as some sort of dopey condition in which we sort of just go into a particular zone. And there's not really this rigor of actual analysis. And that's where we have this tendency to be vague and not really sort of go, well, say, what exactly is it that we're talking about with selflessness? Well, we are talking about a particular understanding of self that when we analyze, we can see it doesn't apply. The self as something that is unique, that's permanent, that's unconditional. That I would supplicate you to please remember. That is how we habitually think of self. And that's where, or singular, that it's singular, that it's permanent, and that it's unconditional. But in fact, when we then look, we can see this whole notion of self is being attributed to what is in fact just a large aggregation of conditions that come together. So that's where Tolkien's image is sort of image of you had You take a stick of incense and you twirl it very quickly, or a torch, and it looks like there's a ring, but in fact, if we look, there's not. Similarly, what seems to be a self is in fact just a lot of conditions that we just impute. Just like we impute ring of fire, we impute self, and what is in fact something that's changing. And that's where we need to humbly be aware, gosh, we take ourselves very seriously. Somebody says something we don't like, we right away, sort of, we get, it can be all sorts of things, it can be an insult. It can be something saying, this person from the political party we don't like is really great. And all of a sudden we're up in arms. So that's where we notice this self as being something that sits as an actual degree of uptightness. It's almost visceral, this sort of sense of self. It's quite solid. It's uptight. It's narrow. And that's where we are introducing this perspective that actually this whole drama around me is not really that solid. People could very well say things that we might dislike, and we just understand they're saying things we dislike without it necessarily touching anything in us. It means we become less narrow-minded, less prone to censor out. We become much more open-minded, accommodating, and we begin to touch reality in a much greater extent. We begin to really sense. We come to our senses. We begin to smell and touch more fully. So that's where we need to address this issue. So the Khenpo says our instinctive emotional attachment or clinging to a vague notion of self is the source of all our suffering. That's it. Now he says, from the idea of self comes that of other. It is from clinging to self that the idea of other arises, and desire, hatred, and delusion arise. There are many kinds of desire, including greed, envy, miserliness. Hatred can take the form of jealousy, anger, and resentment. Delusion includes mental dullness, stupidity, and confusion. From these unhealthy mental states, arise actions motivated by them and their results. So that's where here the Khenpo has spoken about, on the basis of this delusional belief in a self, we also begin to set up what really consolidates the self, which is other. And they play off against each other. There is no self, there is no other, but we fabricate, we fall into sense of me, other. And once we have that, then we have, do I like the other? Do I dislike the other? Whether it's objects or persons or whatever. And that's where we have these three poisons, which are then desire, hatred, and delusions. And these take on particular flavors. There's a variety of desire, a variety of hatred, a variety of delusion. But once we are entangled in those, then we begin to act on them. And that's where these actions that are motivated by these three, you could say, toxic conditions, they then become part of us. And that's what we talk about. Then we have actions that are motivated by them and their results. Action and result. That is the meaning of karma. So we have the poisons, which we call kleshas, and we have karma that then continues the patterning that we've begun. All of that originates with that single delusional condition of fixating on a self. So the Khenpo says the results take the form of all kinds of suffering, which one cannot escape as long as one clings to the skandhas as if they were self. And this is what we call samsara. This is why we circle in samsara. Thus, he says, the only way to remove one's suffering is to realize the skandhas, the aggregates onto which we project self. They are not self. They're there, but the idea of person and the notion of my body, my mind, and all of that, that's not a drama, that's not a problem. But the self, in the sense of the toxicity that solidifies that and thinks others, and from it the karmas and kleshas, that is where the delusion happens. And that's where we, on the basis of attributing self to what in fact is not a self, that's where we then have an issue, and that needs to be addressed. The Khenpo says the wisdom, prajna, that realizes not self is like light removing darkness. Just as darkness cannot exist in light, so suffering cannot exist in the light of wisdom. So we first approach wisdom through reflection, analysis, and so forth, and then it brings about a greater awareness. And it's within that awareness that self cannot get a grip. The whole pain of self doesn't have anywhere to land. And that's where, just like when we switch on the light, well, there's nowhere for the dark to be. Dark can only exist as long as there's something that obscures light. It's the shade, it's the shadows, it's the darkness. And all the Buddha wants to do is to switch on the light and say, hey, it's all okay. You know, there we are stumbling around in the dark, suffering unnecessarily. So the Khenpo continues, where there is suffering, clinging to self must also be present. Where there is clinging to self, ignorance of not self must be present. The only way to remove suffering is therefore to remove the ignorance that causes the clinging to the self. This is where we need to arrive at, and this is where we know now. Now we know what the path is all about. It's not some mysterious something out in the distance. It's addressing this immediate condition that we have right now. So thus the goal for the Shravaka is the removal of suffering. So now, right now, we're talking about Vipassana in the context of what we call the Shravaka Yana, the Shravaka vehicle. And there we would say the Shravaka's goal is removal of suffering. Khenpo says that goal is called nirvana. The Shravaka is not trying to remove the suffering of all beings, nor is he trying to attain Buddhahood. He does not have the vision, the understanding, nor the confidence necessary to do that. His aim is relatively modest. The Shravaka is really the foundation for the journey. So we needn't begin to say, well, it's those people out there, they have a narrow mind. It's really just from the Mahayana perspective, there's a foundational aspect that we can call Shravaka. Nyosho Khenpo Rinpoche, he referred to this as the foundational yana. We sometimes call it Hinayana, because it's where we begin with really dealing with what is immediate, what has to do with us. We need to first begin with ourselves. Charity begins at home. We work with ourselves. And in that sense, Hinayana is not pejorative or denigrating. It's simply just making things simple, doable, manageable. And that's why Hinayana is very helpful. It's the foundation of the path. So presently, there's not a notion of great enlightenment, but there is a notion of peace. And that's why we're talking here about nirvana in the sense of just achieving peace, having some peace of mind, some space. So that's where you could say the aim of the Hinayana, the Shravaka, is relatively modest. Khenpo says it is simply to remove the cause of their own suffering. Nonetheless, one cannot say that their realization of emptiness is not very profound. It is. This is radical. So this is something where we need to pay attention and we need to do it for ourselves. We cannot keep going over these words again and again, emptiness, and just having like, oh, there's something out there that's called emptiness, and it's all very strange and weird and wonderful. We need to have an actual insight into what we mean and to actually begin to cultivate that. And that's why we have respect for what the Shravaka achieves, and yet we're onto it. Just like we might be, we grow an apple tree, but then we look at somebody who has an apple orchard with 1,000 apple trees, and we can understand that's vast. That's a very big orchard, a lot of work, but we have an apple tree ourselves. So we have some idea what's going on in that big orchard. So that's where we approach this, and while we don't have perhaps the complete realization of emptiness, as the Shravaka does, then nevertheless we're onto what this all is about. We've smelt the apples, we've seen them, we're onto it. So the Khenpo says, what is it? We cannot say that his realization of emptiness is not very profound. It is said that it corresponds to that of the Bodhisattvas on the 1st to the 6th levels. And that is where we would say at the 7th level, then the Bodhisattvas begin to outshine the Shravakas in terms of realization of emptiness. Until then, yes, they have an insight into emptiness that's very valid. But eventually, because of the vastness of mind, then the Bodhisattvas, their understanding of emptiness begins to expand far beyond what the Shravakas have. Basically, on the basis of the Bodhisattva's understanding how phenomena and how the self ultimately has absolutely nothing, there's no reference for it whatsoever. The Shravakas, they still say there's a reference, what we call a basis of designation that is there. That's why we say the basis of designation is a truly existing consciousness. The basis of perception of objects is a truly existing phenomena out there, the atoms. And that's where the Shravakas, they understand that phenomena appear in particular ways, but they don't actually exist as such. Just like I would look at the webcam that I'm looking into here, and if I were to analyze, and I know this is made up of particles, so I would say, well, there's actually not really a webcam, there's just a lot of particles. And that's where the Shravakas end. They analyze and they can see what appears to be a webcam, in fact, is just a lot of conditions, a lot of particles labeled in a particular way. But they would say there's an actual real stuff out there, actual particles. That's the ultimate building block of phenomena. And that's where we, for example, in the 20th century, we were brought up with this very sweet idea of the atoms and sort of the models that sort of we were told in school. But nowadays, physicists, they will tell, well, that's kind of like just a tentative explanation. Not really like that. It's far more complex. And there's less and less of what we thought was actually there. So the Bodhisattvas essentially keep going on with their analysis and see that there is actually ultimately nothing that we can see that is there as something that is ultimately existing, something that is indestructible. That's why now we're saying it. There's a web of conditions that create a particular appearance, but there's nothing at the base. And similarly also with the sense of self, it's not just that there is a consciousness that mistakenly is being imputed as a self, but there actually is no consciousness. There is no mind ultimately as something that is inherently existing. We're not saying there's not cognition, but what we're saying is that it doesn't have any inherent, truly absolute essence that we can have as a reference point. So in this way, there is eventually the Bodhisattva's insight into emptiness and also their greatness of mind, their courage, which is not wanting enlightenment for themselves, simply just wanting to serve all sentient beings, freeing all sentient beings from suffering. As such, then their courage and their greatness of mind, eventually, even though they are undergoing the same discipline and the same analysis as the Shravakas, eventually their greatness, we say, outshines the Shravakas. So that's where, referring to that, Khenpo says, it removes the veils of ignorance and confusion that make deeper and more subtle levels of emptiness so inaccessible. So that's where the Bodhisattvas, they go beyond. Therefore, by realizing the not-self emptiness of the skandhas, one is preparing the way for the higher vehicles. So we don't see Shravaka as something inferior. It's just, it's the first, it's like, what do we say? Before we go into high school, what's it called? Primary school, right? Primary school. So that's where it has a role. It prepares the way for the higher vehicles. And there, Khenpo says, those whose goal is not just the removing of one's own suffering, but the suffering of all beings. So eventually then, spontaneously, organically, then the practitioner of the path moves to a place in which there's less and less concern for one's own suffering. Okay. Okay, well, I don't know if it's a good thing. I would like you to please remember what day it is and what class this is. The question is, it's probably a good thing you don't ask us to recap. I'd more than likely confuse what day it is and recap the wrong class. Well, yes, that's normal because, like I was saying, we're so used to everything spiritual. It's kind of just a place where we go into sort of a sweet, sort of fuzzy zone of just feeling good and sort of, But if we're going to get to the bottom of suffering universally, we can't really treat it as a vague project Just like we can't just get into a car and say, oh, wouldn't it be just nice if it took me from A to B, and then we step on the accelerator and then we crash into a telegraph pole. So that's where we can't really approach this in a vague way. We need to actually know. We need to, I would say, sorry, but I would say, please buy the book, download it, get hold of it somehow and read it. Otherwise, it's really a waste of time. It's a waste of time. It has to be something that we actually really, it's addressing the most important thing. We pay taxes, right? We pay our insurance of the car. We pay our mortgage, our rent. We relate to people. We call people by their right names. We actually fully engage with our world, and we cannot just leave this as some sort of vague thing that we just sort of like tune in and then we tune out. We have to actually, this is where the Buddha was a teacher. The Buddha was not just a babysitter or somebody who's sort of there to make us feel good. So are the tears I cry for suffering sentient beings, as they're based on emotion, not from compassion? They must be from my confused self. No, that's a very, very good thing. That is being sensitive beyond just our self-absorption. So already having this soft spot. Yesterday I was going through the text on what we call training the mind. And Trungpa Rinpoche, he made a big point out of this soft spot where we feel. Sometimes we think, oh, if we're spiritual, we don't feel. It's not true. On the spiritual path, we actually really feel. So us beginning to come out of this shell of self-absorption and beginning to feel the pain of others, that's essential. The more we practice the path, the more we feel the suffering of others. So that's essentially why we have the, you could say, analytical approach here of seeing actually the whole drama around the self is unsubstantiated. And then we have the actual application of this analysis, which is then meditation, where we begin to be more and more open. We become more and more vulnerable. We feel more and more. So we become very soft and we feel. And the Bodhisattva is not afraid of feeling. Do you have a download? Hold on. Sorry, Jakob. Am I able to access the book somewhere? Not sure where to look. Do you have a download to share? I think I got it on Kindle. So I do think you can get it on Kindle, even though, yes, last time, oh yes, there was someone last time that very aptly said, please buy from your local bookstore. Jeff Bezos already has enough pesos. He's already plenty cashed up. We don't need to keep sort of supporting Amazon. And there is a place in Australia, there's Bodhi Bookstore down in Sydney, what's called Windhorse Books. And they will be able to get it for us. And I would say if you're ordering the book, well, okay, then meanwhile, you could maybe get the Kindle edition. That is just supporting a real bookstore. Yeah. So my experiences have never been warm and fuzzy. Okay. All right. But I still love it. Okay. Okay. I found the book, yes, on Amazon Australia. And personally, I'm coming to this course really to understand emptiness. Good on you. Yes. Very good idea. Will do. Okay. Okie dokie. Now, meditation procedure. Although when the progressive stages of meditation on emptiness are being taught, one often has little time to meditate on one stage before one is introduced to the next. It is best to take each state at a time and to practice it until some definite experience has arisen. Now, I'd like to say this is where you're a little bit fortunate, because I've personally here presented meditation for the last 13 years here in Australia, coming up 14 years, and I'm always teaching the same thing. So there's always an opportunity to come back to the very basics. Of course, what we're doing here is introducing an analytical component, and that's where the stage that we're talking about here is the one in which we analyze the self, and we can see the absurdity of our addiction and our belief in a self. So that's where we then have that analysis, which is regarded as the first stage. So we think about that, and it's something that we, in that we have a week between each session. There's time to think about that. Then the application, yes, that is where we can sit and we can analyze to some extent, but also what we do here is very much just settling the mind. But with that settling the mind, we're continually confronted with thoughts that arise, one thought after the other. And the degree to which we have some certainty about the fact that when thoughts arise, we could sort of unconsciously latch onto them, and also knowing that we could not. That's where we're actually engaging this vision that's intended with this analysis of us not being deceived by the self that is so keen to be unconscious and just sort of drift into the condition of believing in the thoughts that we're having and the ideas of self and the ideas of whatever we're thinking about. So that's where we have the opportunity to actually test this whenever we're sitting down and we're doing meditation here. But at the same time, this kind of analysis is something we can think about, and it should kind of haunt us. So that's where we do have the opportunity to take each stage at a time, to actually let it settle and begin to actually sort of, you could say, begin to become part of us. We actually begin to have some ownership of these ideas. Somebody comes up and say, hey, you Buddhists, you obviously don't believe in a self. Why is that? Then we should actually begin to say, well, because, I don't believe in Santa Claus, and I don't believe that this so-called self is not anything that actually can be substantially proven. There is nothing that indicates a self. There's nothing which is permanent, singular, unconditional, isn't it? And then we can talk about how we are different people at different times. We're shifting, and we cannot find anything that actually is self. We have body, we have mind, and so on. But we should have that thing that if somebody asks us, then we go, yeah. Just if somebody asks us about vaccinations, do you have an opinion about vaccinations? Oh, yeah. Then we get up on our high horse and we have a lot to say about it. but if we're talking about the most essential thing that we could ever come across, then it's important that we're not at a loss and that we actually have really pondered this. That's more important, really. Yes?
So the fact that there isn't a singular self, there's these different senses of self, I guess, that we have. Does that mean that when we're seeing through, we have to see through all those different senses of self? It's not really a one-shot deal, is it? There's different. We feel like different people at different times. So seeing through all those different people in a way.
It's more that we begin to so the question is, we are seeing so many different selves, and is it then that we see through each of these individual selves? Well, the mere fact that we are beginning to see that we are different selves might begin to sort of dawn on us that there actually is no self. And that's where we're less worried about our reputation. We're less worried about, when we get what we want, when we don't get what we want. And all of a sudden we begin to actually be more at ease. We needn't defend the self. We needn't actually worry about whether we gain what we want or we lose. We have much more acceptance. And that's also where we begin to be more aware, really, of in that the self is not such a big deal. We begin to become more aware about the other and just sort of caring for the other. So it's really in some way, it is a one-shot deal in that we're just realizing that this so-called big drama of the self is a bit unsubstantiated. But at the end of the day, it really boils down to awareness. If we're in awareness, there's not really that much self. It's more when we're unconscious. We tend to go unconscious, and then all of a sudden we fall back on our defenses. We become sort of lost in our obsessions or our ideas. So it's more about us not being lost.
Does it matter to what state we're in, considering if we haven't slept well for a couple of weeks, or
oh yeah,
feeling depressed, or
yeah,
we feel more that clinging to ourselves? Would you say?
Yes, that's where we can see that this. So the question is, how about when we're run down and stressed and so on? Isn't there more of a sense of self there? And definitely. And that's where we can see this whole, you can say, the suffering around self and the uptightness. It so much has to do with conditioning. And that's where it's workable. There is no solid self. It's something that comes, as you could say, as sort of an illness or an unconscious condition in which the more the conditions for unconsciousness is there, lack of sleep, lack of food, stress, and all of that, that's where the self builds up. Yeah, exactly. It proves that it's constructed on the basis of these negative conditions. And then likewise, what we do with the practice of the path is so much try to establish good conditions in which we can see through this hoax. And that's why it's good to have a lifestyle that provides for some good sleep, that we can eat well, that we have less stress. And so you see in the teachings very often there's a recommendation for a healthy lifestyle. Of course, where we very often in the traditional teachings say, well, you know, get thee to a monastery or go to the caves. It's not really an option for somewhere else. That's where we just need to somehow arrive at effectively changing our lifestyle within the existing parameters, within what is actually realistically possible for us. But we can see that the healthy lifestyle and so on, when there's more clarity, that's also the place where we are less unconscious. We're less prone to be sort of, when we're sleepy and stressed, we're sort of lost in our own circles, you know? We very much sort of get caught up in our self-drama. We take ourselves very seriously. We feel that there's all this happening, and it's sort of very much constantly there. And we're sort of caught in that. Whereas when we're rested, then we can deal more constructively, creatively with it, and we begin to see a little bit beyond just the immediate pain of our existence. So that's where it's important that we actually have a foundation also of a good lifestyle. So Khenpo says, it is important to have a regular meditation schedule, beginning with periods of 15 to 30 minutes in the morning and evening. One can build up from there, begin meditating for longer and longer periods. As with study and reflection, a certain amount of perseverance and effort are needed at first, but one should never let one's mind get too tight. So again, we're persevering here, but we shouldn't be sort of, how do you say, become nerdy or obsessive about it. Remember the example of the musician tuning the strings of his instrument. The tension has to be just right, neither too tight nor too loose. And if we happen to have a physical condition, the sense of self tends to cling to that condition. That's right. That's right. So we can see how all these conditions that we have, as long as there's a strong sense of self, it perpetuates an increasingly sense of difficulty, an increasing sense of self. The more we could sort of have a space in which we have less of these kind of, you could say, conditions that are adverse, the better. But there's also a time when we just don't have that choice. And there we might have a physical condition that is just there. So that's where right now we have certain conditions that are unfortunate, but we don't know about the future. The future could bring even more difficult conditions. And that's why we need to practice right now as much as we can. We can never know if we'll have the right conditions in the future. So we really need to seize the day. So the Khenpo, he suggests this practice of meditating in the morning and the evening. It's not that difficult. And so often in the modern world, there is actually time when we very often think, oh, well, I should relax now and so on. And then that's a great way of relaxing. There's nothing in meditation, there's nothing that's not to like about meditation. It's different from what we're used to, where we're very often used to be essentially looking for something that just makes us feel safe. So it can be particular habits. It can be TV. It can be particular ways of distracting ourselves in one way or another. And that's where what we're proposing with meditation is non-distraction. So that's a little bit uncomfortable, but we're not doing it in a tense way. It's just non-distraction in a easy way. So that's where meditation is actually should be done like Khenpo was saying, a bit like the student of the Buddha, Shona, who was really trying so hard, and then he would give up, and then he'd try so hard again, then he'd give up. Finally, he asked the Buddha, what should I do? This is not working. And the Buddha said, well, you tend to get very tense and you tend to get very loose. And he said, yeah. He says, when you used to be a musician, was your instrument, were the strings supposed to be tight or loose? And he said, neither. They should be neither too tight nor too loose. And the Buddha said, voila, there you are. So the Khenpo says, choose a definite time in the morning and evening to sit in meditation. Sit in a good meditation posture and always begin by taking refuge in rousing bodhicitta motivation to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So this is what we do here with the context of the Buddha sadhana that precedes the practice. We take refuge, arouse the bodhicitta, and we invoke the presence of the Buddha, and then we sit in meditation. So this is very easy to do. Anybody who's attending this class, if you don't have access to this sadhana, it's available on Lodrötaye House, but I've sort of adapted it a little bit to what we do here. So if it's not in the resource folder in the Dropbox, remind me and I'll upload it. Anybody here is welcome to take a copy with them home. So I've just got a new printer. I hope it works. Then I'll be able to print new copies. So don't worry about that. So then Khenpo says, when you first begin the practice, reflect for some time on the meaning of not self and investigate in the manner explained above. However, once you have developed some confidence and understanding, do not bother to keep investigating. Just go straight into the emptiness meditation. And that's what we do here. When we say emptiness meditation, there's no sense that we're going to go into some incredible space. What we're doing is just coming back to mindfulness in which we're not tagging along distractedly. And that is being properly awake, present, conscious, as opposed to unconscious and just being following one thought after the other and just sort of lost in thought and thoughts and thoughts and thoughts. That's where we have the practice of mindfulness that opens up, takes us to be present, sustaining presence. That qualifies as what we call settling meditation, settling into emptiness, settling into not solidifying anything. So just being aware is good. But initially also we should begin to see how it's funny that we construct self on the basis of something that is ever changing, and how we solidify things on what is in fact impermanent, constructed, and so on. And that's of course also we look in the world and we can see the people who are obsessed with what is apparent, how they suffer as a consequence, and how they make bad decisions, and how the people who actually look beyond just self, how the people who are not attached to the material and the gross, how they're free. It's not that hard really to see the difference in it, and to just simply want to follow that example is enough inspiration really to motivate us. So that's where we approach this in terms of first actually thinking about it, analyzing, and then eventually we also let go of the analysis. The Khenpo says to keep returning to the investigatory stage after confidence has arisen is like keep switching a light on and off without any purpose. Once the light is on, then leave it on. When you reach the real meditation stage of your practice, there will be no more need for reflection. You should just rest in the meditation without any hesitation. But to get there first needs to be an understanding of what we're saying here. No self. We need to do that. We might think it's inconvenient and drag, and couldn't we just meditate and visualize Tara and chant mantras and so on? That forget about all this. Do we have to be bothered by this analysis? Yes, because we can see this is where we and all sentient beings, we fail. We take self seriously. We project solidity onto others. We think that such and such a politician is really a bad person. No, they do bad things and stupid things, but they're not bad. There's not a single bad sentient being. We project, however, rigidly, and it gets us roused then all of a sudden we're roused in a way in which we become rigid and unbearable to ourselves, to others. And this rigidity is not helpful for anybody. That's what creates wars. So that's where we need to come back to an openness that understands, that has wisdom. And with that wisdom comes compassion. So that's where we initially need to have that clarity about where is it we're going with this. Then when we have that, then we can feel the value of just settling into the mind that doesn't fixate. So the Khenpo says, at the end of each session, dedicate all the merit to enlightenment of all beings. Between sessions, reflect again and again on how there is no self in the skandhas, and think of everything as being like a dream, a film, or a magical illusion. What is appearing as a self is not your real self, is not yourself really. Thinking like this, how can unhealthy emotions such as greed, hate, and delusion arise? If these do not arise, how can suffering arise? And we know suffering comes about due to us being upset about things in a particular way, or wanting things that we don't presently have, but then hankering for it, or simply just not being in touch. Attachment, aversion, ignorance. So this is where it's important that we begin to not be so naive. We stop our naive belief in the reality, just like we stop thinking that what's happening in the movie is real. It's doable. So the out-breath, one dissolves into emptiness. That's mindfulness. So that's very good. That's where we focus and we just relax. There's no need to think emptiness, not to think anything. Just be mindful as the breath goes out, gap, the breath comes in, again, attentive to the mindfulness. But when we're focused in that way, this is important. It's so important to be focused on that way, not in a rigid way, but just being focused on it. That's where we forget thoughts. Until we actually have the focus on the breath, then our focus inevitably is dragged along by thought after thought after thought. So the practice of shamatha, of focusing on the breath as it comes out, it interrupts our normal entanglement, fascination with our thoughts. I am like this, I am like this, I am like this, I am like this. This is bad, this is good, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is good, this is good, this is good. These are thoughts after thoughts after thoughts. The moment we just come back to the breath, then we get out of our heads. We get out of this addiction to fixating on the thoughts. The thoughts are there, they're welcome, there's not a problem, but our attention is on the breath. And there we just attentive to the breath, goes out, gap. In breath, attention to the out breath, gap. Again, attention to the out breath, gap. That's where our attention goes. Focusing just like if we were threading a needle, just if we were focused on something that requires our attention. We're focused. Thoughts will come as they will, but the actual presence of just being attentive to the breath, it cuts the ordinary entanglement in our thoughts. It sounds perhaps strange, it sounds maybe mystical, but hopefully it also sounds doable. It is doable. Let's say I'm looking at this and see there's a little blue light in my mouse here. Then I'm aware of that. Then somebody says, Jakob, look at the writing down here. Then I look down there. Then they say, look up at the blue light. Then they say, look down at the sign. At that time, I'm already focused on these two things. My mind is there, then my mind is there. It's not really concerned with what I was just thinking. It's actually distracted, if you like, from the ordinary entanglement in the thoughts. And it actually takes us out of our thoughts. So there we are coming back to the breath. We're out of the thoughts. And that's where the shamatha has that quality of facilitating that we get out of our heads, our ordinary addiction to the various thoughts that drive us. Once we have that, then there's a discovery of freedom from the thoughts. And the thoughts are allowed to be there. They're naturally there, but we just label them. We just think, oh yeah, there's thoughts happening. back to that blue light, back to the the name, etc. Back to the breath. That's what we're doing. But it won't help to sit down and look terribly serene and then to just keep wondering the usual thoughts, you know. That's where I love this in one of Leonard Cohen's writings. He describes how Leonard Cohen, you know, he's a practitioner of Buddhism, and that was such a great, I love so much he wrote this. He says, I sat down and I lit a stick of incense and I sat in front of my shrine on my safu, and then for an hour and a half I sat and pondered how much I hated my ex-wife. See, that's honesty. That's beautiful. You know, if he had said, I sat down and went into a deep spiritual trance, and so like, yeah, right, you know, an hour and a half, you probably would have thought of dinner or going to the toilet at one point, right? But that sort of honesty of just saying, I sat there and basically just was entirely distracted. That is so valuable. That's honest. And that's also when I, as a meditation instructor, I sometimes on retreat, people come and say, yeah, I had really good meditation. For the entire session, I had no distraction. Luckily, that doesn't happen. But almost sometimes you have people who are like, I had something really special happen. You have to say, well, you know, but when you have these people come in and say, gosh, I just sat and thought about, you know, my, you know, taxes. I sat and talked about my business. I sat and thought about what's for lunch. I had all these thoughts. That's good. That's where we need to begin. Honesty, knowing what's happening in our mind, not sort of unconsciously like, I don't know what I'm thinking, you know, knowing what's happening in our mind. And then while we know what's happening in our mind, then coming back to the breath. We're aware of what's happening in the mind, but then again, we also could choose to sort of be attentive, to be mindful, to be properly conscious. I find it difficult to not focus on the breath as well as the out-breath. I find it difficult not to focus on the in-breath as well as the out-breath. Look, us having difficulty with whatever we're doing doesn't mean that things will forever have like that. 2 weeks from now, you won't have that problem. Maybe you will. Then 2 months from now, you won't have that problem. But we are the way we are on the basis of our conditioning. We can change. It's not like I am a person who cannot focus on the out-breath without also focusing on the in-breath. We're not like that. We change. We're flexible. We're not in one way or another. We're not final products. We change on the basis of our conditioning. So I promise you, as you just focus on the out-breath, you'll initially be thinking, gosh, I'm really focusing on the in-breath also. Eventually, there'll be a day where you forgot that you used to focus on the in-breath. So it's doable. It's not that I'm sort of vehemently and sort of against focusing on the in-breath. It's not that bad. But it's just there's a value in the out-breath and that it connects us to something greater. So it's a little bit of a trick, if you like. But that's where we need to remember we are not fixed in one particular way also. And that's also where we understand we're not one solid, unchanging self. We are products of just one moment after the other, continuously changing. So far, when it comes to Vipassana, my head is like a steam cooker. Well, the same thing applies. Yes, sure. My head is like a steam cooker. Then 2 weeks from now, it won't be like a steam cooker. You know, we change. We're always changing. We might not even think of it because we're there one moment after the other. But we do change continually. And that's where all the little things we have in the Buddhist teaching, from offering a flower on the shrine, to making incense offerings, or to cleaning up our shrine, or to making something for others, and all of these things, they continually open us up further and further. Everything we have in the Buddhist teaching actually facilitates this kind of greater openness. So again, right now our head might be like a steam cooker. Well, tomorrow, you know, it'll be less like a steam cooker, you know? You sort of like the let the steam out a little bit. So all of this to say really that we can condition ourselves because we have no self. We're not stuck. And that's also where not being stuck, then there's less basis for this unconscious practice of dislike, like, attachment, aversion, and so on. There's less basis for that. So without that, like the Khenpo says, if these do not arise, how can suffering arise? And there you go. Isn't that a nice image? Ha. It's a bit like this one. This one here. Huh? This is also very sort of shamatha-like. Hi. So after all these words, then we've reached the moment of great peace. So we just settle. Any questions from the live studio audience here? Okay. Well, I thought to end it here because we're at the end of the chapter. And so next week we'll graduate from the Shravakayana to then what we call the Mahayana, basically, to the first section of the Mahayana, which is called the Chittamatra. So that's going to be in the next section that we look at here, the Chittamatra school. This one here, mind only. And that is really where we begin to, you could say, distance ourselves from the materialistic idea that there is solid atoms, that there's solid consciousness, and we begin to understand that something is being created, and that's where we understand the creator is the mind. So that's what the Chittamatra school is all about. Okay, if there's no further questions, we'll just dedicate, and then in a few minutes, then we'll have a break, and then we'll proceed to the next section, which is meditation. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you. Okay. So welcome again to our second component of the program, which is then meditation. And I'll just say a little bit about meditation, specifically actually in relation to what we were just talking, which is this place where we begin to see that we're not that solid. We're not that sort of stuck in being one way or another. In fact, we are continually changing, and where we actually mistakenly, in sort of an unconscious state, tag along with particular narratives, particular ways of seeing the world, we again and again also see that we're much better off when we're not uptight around self and when we're not rigidly fixated on our way of seeing things in one way or another. So we are naturally actually prone to, and we naturally have a capacity for what we could say vipassana. In fact, vipassana is really the insight that the objects in themselves don't possess any inherent real existence. So like I sometimes say, you have a woman who's called Jane, and she'll be the mother of one person and will be the partner of another person and the daughter of a third person. So Jane in and of herself is neither a daughter, is neither a partner, is neither a mother. But according to the particular individuals, then there will be a relative truth in perceiving Jane as a particular way. And that we all understand. People who are married to somebody are not going to argue with their in-laws whether or not Jane is a daughter or a partner. You're not going to argue with a kid whether or not the person in question, Jane, is a mother or a partner or a daughter. So that's where we naturally understand how phenomena don't exist in one particular way solidly. So that's where our opinions and rigidity around constructing things then in ways that we like and dislike, we understand this comes from the way that we project onto things. So that's where we have a much easier relationship to the entire world. We might meet somebody who says, okay, this is my opinion, and they have a particular opinion about them, and we just stand there and we say, yes, yes, and we know that it's their particular opinion. They have the truth. And then you meet somebody else who says the opposite, and they really believe what they mean. And then you know it's true for these persons. But the ability to not fixate on anything as being one way or another is really the core of what we call vipassana. Vipassana is where we are conscious, we have an open condition of mind that understands how truth exists, particularly from our own perspective. And that's where we can also see that this might sound very philosophical and theoretical and interesting, weird and wonderful, but it actually is that place where we then have strong attachments to things in one way. We have strong aversions to things in a particular way. We think about things or people in one particular way. And that's where we begin to have strong likes and dislikes and so forth. So that's where we can see that we actually go wrong if we have just that inkling that our rigidity, and this you could say we can understand that in some sort of theoretical way, but we can also see how it feels viscerally in terms of our feeling, in terms of the sort of somatic experience of uptightness that takes place. If somebody does something that we profoundly dislike, there's a strong retreating into a place of fear, alienation, dislike. And that's where there's an uptightness that takes place that is not very helpful to deal with. Let's say there is a difficult situation. We become uptight in a particular way that's not going to help us actually work with that particular situation. So that's where it's never really helpful, this way in which we react with the likes and dislikes. So this is where it's not just theoretical understanding. It has a lot to do with the way that we're interacting with the whole field of our life, the whole experience of ourself and our world. And that's where it's very helpful, where we can begin to relax and be more open-minded. Like we were just talking about before, we can see that if we haven't eaten well, if we're underslept, if we're stressed, then we're much more prone to become very uptight, nervous, defensive, sad, depressed. And when we're more relaxed, we're much more prone to actually just be accommodating and open-minded and so forth. So we can see that this whole drama, the whole sense of self, is very much something that's conditioned. So what we do with meditation is actually provide ideal conditions. It's not like meditators, they sit down because they think that enlightenment is going to come from just sitting. But the thing is, when we sit, we provide the ideal conditions for allowing the mind to really have the space to actually begin to be less entangled in, you could say, our normal unconsciousness, and begin to be more open, more conscious, more alive, more present, more awake. And so what we're doing all along the path is really just providing a dimension of being more and fully awake. That is, in fact, what we mean with the Buddha, the awakened one. And all we're doing along the path is really just providing the conditions in which we could be more open, more present, and more awake. And when we fail to do that, we retreat into these, you could say, vacuous places where we go inward, spiral downward, and become more and more rigid around ourselves, or rigid around what we perceive. And that's where we can then see, in the example of the Buddha or our guru, we can see how there is an openness of mind, there's a wakefulness. And with that come really all the qualities that we associate with enlightenment. There comes the quality of less self-centering, more awareness of the other, more compassion, more energy, more alertness, more being sharp, more being onto what's happening. So that's where the Buddha, very kindly, he didn't just say, well, wake up, and it's, there's not really a solidity in neither the subjective dimension of our person, nor is there a solidity in the perceived object out there, and just get with the program. Everything's actually, ungraspable. Everything is open. Everything's empty. The Buddha didn't just say that, even though the Buddha pointed that out. Then what the Buddha provided was an actual path where it's not just about us beginning to subscribe to a set of doctrines or dogmas, but very much a path in which there's a way to work with our condition. And that's where the Buddha then prescribed the methodology of meditation. And so the methodology of meditation is where we have two components. One is that we provide a context of calm, where the mind can calm down, where we provide a place where the body is still and where the mind then is properly present, essentially not distracted, properly here. And this is what nowadays is sort of being appropriated in psychology as what we call mindfulness. Unfortunately, the problem with mindfulness, as it's being marketed, is that it's very much about feeling better. And that's where mindfulness is sort of having a great, you could say, sort of a heyday in psychology, because it's, there's a new sort of method that actually would make us feel better, be less stressed, and it has this objective of essentially allowing us to succeed the way that we've always wanted to, namely, I'm better. And that's where the appropriation of mindfulness is a little bit problematic. First of all, because then essentially the success of mindfulness is whether or not does it make us feel better. And then some people, with inability to focus, they might throw in the towel and say, I've tried mindfulness, it doesn't help. I'm still feeling, I still feel crabby. So that's where mindfulness is not really, in the Buddhist context, it's really just about us beginning to properly connect with our reality. We're not particularly interested in whether we feel good or bad. It's actually just about us beginning to be present. But the thing is, if we understand what the Buddhist teaching really is about, which is the insight into vipassana, what we call the view, and the understanding that we need to let go of this rigidity around the self and the rigidity around our perceptions, then being properly present allows for that. But at that point, when we're practicing mindfulness, we're not particularly concerned how we feel. And that's where there's a big difference between hooking mindfulness up and yoking it to the project of essentially feeling good, and the Buddhist project, which is basically about becoming more open, more awake. Us being more open and being more awake might entail that we're not feeling particularly good, and acknowledging that there's a presence of feeling in a particular way. But that generally just makes us have more empathy and able to feel. And there's not really a sense in the Buddhist teaching that all of a sudden you should become numb and insensitive and so on. So it's all right to feel. We can feel good, we can feel bad, but feeling is actually a good thing. And that's also what allows us to begin to feel for others, to have compassion. We're not retreating into some sort of comfort zone in which we have a cocoon in which we feel okay and are essentially insensitive to what's happening around us. All along within the practice of meditation and sustaining openness, we're actually open to whatever might arise. And so the technique when we're practicing shamatha is very much about just coming back to being fully present. We don't have an objective that I should feel in a particular way. I should feel particularly good. That's very much a product of the contemporary culture of psychologization, where we continually are like, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? And are you feeling good? Or you're not feeling good? Oh, that's terrible. There's a lot of other cultures where people don't really ask that question. They don't really care how you feel. We're just getting on with our life. And the sort of the whole fascination around feeling, you could say it's sort of hooked up with, you could say, a rather new discipline, which is psychology in the West. The West has never really studied the mind. And so over the last 100 years, then psychology initially was about discovering the mind, but then very quickly it became hooked up with pathology. And simply just, according to the lines of Sigmund Freud, is very much about curing particular pathological conditions. And then psychology is all about us feeling better. And so if we have really severe psychosis and are maladjusted and so on, well, sure, psychology is wonderful. It can do wonders in these terms. And in general, psychology speaks the language of our culture. So it's all very good and has its role, but it doesn't really go into properly understanding our being. And so as such, the language of psychology ends up being continually this thing of feeling good and aiming towards us having it better. Whereas in the Buddhist teaching, yeah, we'll sometimes feel good, we'll sometimes feel bad. That's basically, you could say, proportionate with the conditions that are present in our mind. We're going to have conditions that are present that will bring about happiness. We're going to have conditions present that will bring about not feeling particularly good. But all along, what we're doing on the practice of meditation is becoming more and more open, more and more accepting, more and more robust, more and more willing to be participants in the world rather than retreating into some particularly refined spiritual comfort zone. So that's where the practice of non-distraction, shamatha, leads to this condition of wider perspective, more acceptance, more awakening. So in terms of the method that we're employing here, we practice shamatha through the practice of coming back to the breath. Now, when we do the meditation, we hook this up with the practice of Jamgön Rinpoche's the Treasury of Blessings, where we very briefly at the beginning invoke the presence of the Buddha. But then we dissolve the reference point of the Buddha as external and essentially work on the dimension of Buddha within, which is the awakening that's taking place within ourselves. And that's where, as we're meditating, we then come back to the foundation really of shamatha, which is the practice of non-distraction, being properly present. And so we do this having a reference point as we're meditating, coming back to the breath. So as we sit, then inevitably the mind has its natural sort of capacity for actually not really being present. It kind of tends to always sort of wander off and wants to be entertained with the familiar. There's always thoughts, there's always objects, memories, and so on. What we're doing with practice of mindfulness is actually bringing the mind back to being properly here, properly alive. Otherwise, we're sort of a little bit lost in a vacuous state. It's very possible for us to drive from one end of a big city to the other without ever properly being there. We actually are driving all the way on autopilot. So the practice of, we can say we can live our entire life actually not really being present and always sort of just hankering for sort of there's going to be better moments up ahead. And then there's a better moment up ahead. And all of a sudden life is gone, just waiting for something, what's coming next. And so with the practice of mindfulness, we actually have the very good news that we're not particularly trying to aim for a particular state, but we're just trying to be here. And that we always are. We're never really trying to go into a particular zone. We're simply just trying to be properly, fully participating in where we are. And that's what we call mindfulness, being fully present, not distracted. Of course, it's our habit to be distracted. So that's why we train in just coming back. And we need something that anchors us in the present moment, which is then the reference point of the breath that we come back to. So in terms of the technique, the first aspect is to have a posture, sitting either on a chair or on the floor, however is convenient, but having then a posture that's straight. We also take the shoulders a little bit back. We take the chin a bit in. We relax the jaw. We place our hands on our knees or in our lap, and we take the shoulders a bit back, the chin a bit in, and then lower the gaze. And while we don't close the eyes, because we are not sort of trying to sort of, what do we call it, to practice sensory deprivation, we're not sort of closing out any of the senses, then lowering the gaze enables us to come back to being properly present, simply just being without too much distraction. Lowering the gaze helps us to not be distracted. So that's the first aspect of the technique, which is the physical aspect. And that provides a sense of grounding, us being properly relating to our body, properly here in our body. The second aspect then is the mind, and that's where we, as we're meditating, we focus on the breath. We come back to the breath. And the breath is essentially not something conceptual. And that's why it's very important that we have something that doesn't feed our, you could say, normal tendency to be lost in thought. And that's why coming back to the breath is very, very helpful. Rather than if we're just sitting, then we might be sitting drifting with thinking one thought after the other. Or if we're meditating, we might be sitting there wondering, I wonder if this is the state of mind, or I wonder if this is insight, or I wonder if this is wisdom, or I wonder if this and the other. Simply just coming back to the breath has nothing to do with anything conceptual, has nothing to do with anything particular in our heads. It's actually taking our mind out of our heads, coming back to something that's very real, simply just the breath. And that's why we focus on the out breath in this tradition, because the out breath is what connects us to greater space. And then we let the in breath happen. Again, we're aware of the out breath, and that's where we come back to. And it's on the basis of this continual attention to just coming back to the breath that we begin to interrupt the ordinary fascination of our thinking. You could say our thinking consists of one thought after the other, after the other, after the other, where we continue one stream of thought. And of course, eventually they change. But as long as they're there, we tend to solidify them and be very caught up in whatever it is that we're thinking about. And so that's where being aware that they're thoughts, but just coming back to the breath, this provides a place where we actually sort of break the circuit. And that's where we begin to come out of our heads. We begin to be present. And that's very refreshing. And that's where the practice of shamatha is what enables us to just come back to being properly here. And that we do when we're doing sitting meditation, coming back to the breath. When we do walking meditation, it's where we just focus on the feeling of the footstep as we're walking. But all of that is coming out of our heads. It's coming out of our ordinary sort of fascination with our thinking. It breaks the continuity of thoughts. And that's where this practice is very helpful, because once we understand how thoughts are actually solidifying the notion of self, and how thoughts is what's solidifying the notion of the phenomenal world that we're perceiving, then this is where the practice of shamatha also leads to vipassana. That's the place where our insight begins to actually become something that we properly experience. And that's where, at that time, of course, when we do like we did in the previous session, the investigation, analyzing, not finding a permanent, unique, unconditional self, when we analyze and we see that, then this analytical understanding, it creates some certainty. But here at this time of meditating, we're actually not analyzing. We're just doing what's called settling meditation. And this is where this kind of practice comes from the Dzogchen tradition and Mahamudra tradition. And it is then the practice that essentially involves us settling into a vipassana experience on the basis of us gradually being less prone to naively kowtowing to and being controlled by the rigidity of our thinking. We begin to have this greater openness, whatever arises in our minds. We just come back to the breath. The strength of our thoughts are strongly diminished. And that's where simply focusing on the breath is something that's entirely non-conceptual, even though there's a reference point. We have something that essentially takes us out of our ordinary, you could say, vacuous, distracted condition of just tagging along with the thinking. And so that's where this practice, it enables us to discontinue our ordinary, you could say, familiar narratives in which we construct ourselves in a particular way, construct a sense of self-identity, construct storylines about others, and perpetuate storylines about others. And we can see if we're not come back to being present, then particularly sometimes if we just don't have anything to do, then we just construct storylines that become more and more rigid and more heavy and more solid. Very often if we go out in the garden and we're just working in the garden, then we have less of that. Then we're sort of out of our heads. So we can see the degree to which we allow ourselves to tag along with the ordinary storylines, the more solid they become. And that's where in the practice of meditation, we actually are onto what's happening within our mind. And that's where this condition of not being distracted facilitates us being less caught up in the ordinary storylines of our thinking. And so this meditation we then preface with first invoking the teacher, the Buddha, inseparable from our own teacher, but invoking that dimension which is not entangled by the ordinary ego and not entangled by the ordinary, you could say, ordinary conceptions, the ordinary thoughts. Invoking the presence of the Buddha is a bit like being in the presence of a great sage, and the sort of the ordinary thoughts fall away. So that's where we, as we're meditating, initially then first taking refuge, developing an enlightened motivation, wishing the benefit of all beings, then invoking the Buddha. We do this on the basis of also visualizing the Buddha there. So even though it's only quite briefly at the beginning of the session that we visualize the Buddha, putting some effort into having the Buddha's presence there is something that stops the ordinary mind that's sort of like dragging along with ordinary concerns. It actually stops, it actually falls away when there is something truly great. If we have a teacher, then just think of the teacher. But we know the presence of the teacher tends to sort of just, you could say, blow our minds. So sort of in that presence, our ordinary perceptions, ordinary concerns, they melt away. Very often people have questions for their teacher, then they go up and they're going to ask the teacher something, and then the question is just gone. They forgot. It's sort of like, oh, it's all, no need. And that's where we would say, like Jamgön Kongtrul Lodrötaye says, whenever I see your form, ordinary perceptions fall away. Whenever I hear your speech, great bliss arises. Whenever I think of you, the ordinary concerns and fears, they're ravished away. As I called out to you only, Father, think of me with love. And that's the way in which we invoke the Buddha, invoke the teacher. So that's where we preface the practice of meditation a little bit with this, you could say, the spirit of bhakti, this spirit of devotion, which really invokes the presence of something greater. And when there is that, you could say, humility and that devotion that is open with regards to the presence of the Buddha, then there is the possibility of what we call blessing, that the feeling of the teacher, the greatness of the teacher, the magnanimity, and the extraordinary quality that, of course, is ultimately intangible. We begin to have a sense of that. We mingle with that. And that's where invoking the teacher, invoking the Buddha at the beginning of the practice, it's much more than just us coming back to the breath and being present and not being carried away by thoughts. It also invokes a dimension of something extraordinary, what we call then the quality of wisdom. So we'll do that. I'll just take a 2-minute break and then we'll begin the meditation practice. Okay, thank you. Pranaya. In the Samadhi Raj Sutra, it is said, those who while walking, sitting, standing, or sleeping recollect the moon-like Buddha will always be in the Buddha's presence and will attain the vast nirvana. And his pure body is the color of gold. Beautiful is the protector of the world. Whoever visualizes him like this practices the meditation of the Bodhisattvas. In keeping with this, we should practice remembering our incomparable teacher, the Lord of Sages, in the following way. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus, sun, and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, Lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture. His right hand gracefully poised in the earth, touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent, he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 closed suns, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him, and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadras, offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings ceaselessly in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. For all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the 3 jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Jayata Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 Om 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 Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to rise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels, in all the direction of the worlds and the 10 directions, to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma, so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dharma Dhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings nor life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dharmata, where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping on to a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with this flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be. and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadugani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you very much for joining us here. See you again.